In the gospel, Jesus sends out the 72 disciples to the towns that he intends to visit. So I think I have it a little bit easier than they did, because Jesus has been at St. Jane Frances and St. Mary's and St. Joseph's for a long time already. So thank you for welcoming me to your parishes. I was reading just a little bit about your histories. I found that Pierce was the oldest community, founded in 1871. At that time, the first Catholics were being served by missionary priests that made their rounds on horseback to say Mass, not yet at any church, but in homes. So I'm kind of glad I don't have to go horseback while I'm here. In the 1880s, priests had to come from West Point and from Norfolk, and then later on also from Hartington and Creighton to be able to serve our communities. It wasn't until 1889 when the first Mass was celebrated here in Randolph. St. Jane Frances' first church wasn't then built and dedicated until 1892. St. Joseph's a couple years before that, and St. Mary's a few years later in 1897. During that early time, St. Mary's was actually connected to St. Jane Frances for about 3 years before being reconnected elsewhere. And then about 100 years later, it seems, your histories came back together in 2007, and then the three parishes together in 2019. So, I'm trying to learn a little bit more about your communities. In the gospel, we have the 72 disciples returning to Jesus, rejoicing for all that they see that he has done through them. And so I too want you to know that I rejoice, that I'm very happy to be here as your priest. I feel so welcomed already by those that I have met. Looking forward to meeting all of you. I also grew up in a rural area out on a farm outside of Howells. So I'm glad that when the bishop told me to move, that he has allowed me to stay in the rural area. Though it's always difficult when, as a priest, we have to leave those that we have come to know and love. But I want you to know that when I received his call, I did also have this sense of peace in coming to serve you. As the gospel acclamation says tonight, let the peace of Christ control our hearts. It's a sure sign of God's presence when we have that. I'm looking forward to meeting you and to be able to follow up the numerous priests who have served you before myself. Your beautiful churches are just one sign of the commitment that you have to your faith. I have to say I haven't studied too much of the life of St. Jane Frances de Chantal, but I do feel a kind of connection because I have been very much formed by reading the words of her spiritual director, St. Francis de Sales. And since learning that I was coming here, I've begun to pray more the Seven Sorrows of the Blessed Virgin Mary devotion, connected with St. Mary's Church. And with the year of St. Joseph that just happened in 2021, my devotion to St. Joseph has strengthened deeply. So I want you to know, too, that I love to be a priest. I love the sacraments, especially the Mass, to hear confessions. You'll be able to find me before our Masses back in the confessional. Come and receive God's mercy. I love to teach the faith as well, so I'm happy to come to parishes where we also have a school included. I want to be able to assist you in understanding where Jesus is acting in our lives, and even, maybe especially when things aren't always going well for us, or when we have to go through difficult changes, new things. As Jesus warns his disciples in the gospel, that there will be times in which we might even feel like lambs among wolves. That was true for the early disciples and the apostles. They had many challenges and they had to make many sacrifices. It was true for your ancestors to be able to build your parishes. For example, in 1894, St. Jane Frances Parish found it difficult to support their resident pastor, the first one that they had. And so it said that when he ran out of food, he thought he'd be forced to leave, but then everybody got together to be able to scrimp some kind of food for him. In 1897, St. Mary's first church ended up being destroyed by a tornado, even before they were able to dedicate the church. And they had to go back to say Mass in a home until it was rebuilt. And similar thing in 1902, St. Joseph's Second Church, which the first church was actually a converted public school that they converted. When their final actual church was finally built, it too was damaged by a windstorm and knocked slightly off of its foundation. So, in the past in our parishes, we've had challenges and changes, and so too we will continue to experience that in our own times. With regard to that, I'm sure you've probably heard a few things with regard to the journey of faith, pastoral planning process, and maybe some of us might have questions as to what that's all about. So, in the coming weeks, we'll be able to share more about that. The past few months, even before I came here, I've been involved with the planning process, meeting with leaders from your parishes as well as the parishes that'll be part of our larger family of parishes, both the family that St. Jane Frances and St. Mary's will be in, and also the family that St. Joseph will join. So I pray that you will share with me whatever fears or hopes that you may have with this, and I promise to be open and honest and be able to share about the planning process with you. These changes are related in part to what Jesus says in the gospel, that the harvest is abundant, but the laborers are few. Not only does that mean that we have fewer young men that have heard the call of God to labor as priests, but it also tells us that we, each of us, need to be re-energized to live out our baptismal calls. To not just focus on how do we maintain our own communities, our own parishes, but to be like those 72 in the gospel and to go out, to go forth, to invite others to come and join us and meet the Lord here. Like those 72, we can be fearful and when facing something new, but like those 72, when they came back, they experienced the great joy of how Jesus can work through each of us. So having just arrived as your shepherd, I have to ask you to be patient with me. Unfortunately, the Archbishop has not sent you a perfect priest. But I'll do my best to be your spiritual father and guide. And so I ask for your prayers and your help. Jesus instructed his disciples to proclaim the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is at hand. And so together, we will continue to build up the kingdom of God here in Pierce and Cedar counties.